it is a great step, and we're happy about that, but we are also not yet at the end of the journey. So we are happy, but there's more work to be done as well, and that is what is important, the work. So happy, but keep going.
Thank you. Jelle?
Yeah, my name is Jule Schnatenbeck, and I'm part of World's Youth for Climate Justice, so the kind of international youth network that was founded because we were inspired by what young people in the Pacific were asking, this bold request that they were making. And I'd like to add, you said very beautifully, you believe in the power of law, and I think we specifically believe in the power of the people and the law. And so we're very optimistic, and we always call ourselves stubborn optimists when people said, oh, this is the highest court, this is quite impossible, it's really difficult. We said we love the challenge, bring it on, we'll keep fighting. Yeah.
Thank you. Laura?
Thank you. I'm Laura Clark. I'm the CEO of Client Earth, and you saw in the film Client Earth we work across the full life cycle of the law to really try and drive the radical change we need for people and planet. What do I feel when I think about these international legal initiatives? I think they should be a galvanizing moment for us, because we know, we've seen in the global stocktake that we are not on track by any stretch of the imagination. We know that this is absolutely the critical decade, and at the end of this decade we're either way off track or we have managed to get our house in order. And so I see these advisory opinions as really galvanizing in terms of articulating what it is that states need to do. So you're bringing that pressure from the international side, and of course the pressure from underneath as well.
Thank you, Laura. And Christina, welcome as well. Thank you. You're coming with a lot of expertise and different responsibilities.
Yeah.
Can you tell us?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for organizing this panel and for being here. Thanks for the invitation. Well, my name is Christina Voigt. I am a professor of law at the University of Oslo in Norway. In the program, I'm listed as the co-chair of the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee, which is correct, but I won't necessarily speak in that capacity. I am also the chair of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, and that is a different story, because the World Commission, the IUCN, is part in all three advisory proceedings, and I'm the counsel of the IUCN in all three of them, and I'm writing currently the submissions for the ICJ and the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. And am I? Well, yeah, I am excited. It's a very important moment in terms of getting clarity on the law. We'll get back to that. What does the law say? What are the legal obligations? I think that's what we can expect from those courts. But I'm also a little bit nervous, because we don't know yet what those courts will say.
Thank you. And last but not least, Payam, thank you for joining us well.
Hello. Hi. Oh, yeah, sorry. Well, thank you very much to Client Earth for organizing this panel and for inviting me with such distinguished colleagues. And I wish to acknowledge first and foremost our youth representatives here and in the audience for the amazing leadership that they have showed. My name is Payam Akhavan. I'm a professor at Massey College, University of Toronto, and an international practitioner, lawyer. And I had the privilege of representing the Commission of Small Island States before ITLOS and now in the ICJ advisory proceedings. And this is a great experiment. It's a new chapter in the struggle for climate justice. The jury is still out, both on the substance of the opinion, but also on the galvanizing effect which it has, whether in civil society or the diplomatic community. But if I could just quote one Prime Minister of a small island state who I represent, who said, what have we got to lose? Our islands are going to disappear in the near future. And it is a measure of desperation which has pushed the small island states to litigate these issues. If the Paris Agreement was taken seriously, we wouldn't be here.
Thank you. That's to start about yourselves, your roles, responsibilities, and how you feel about this process and mobilization. So from being happy but also a bit nervous about the process, I think it's the right moment to discuss about why are we engaging around this? What does it mean? And how do we do it? And so for that, I'd like to begin with you, Payam, to understand from ITLOS and what you did. We had some hearings last September, and no International Court of Justice. with the submissions by the end of January, understanding a bit more why engaging around this process. Can you tell us more? And we'll have a video as well to explain in just a minute what happened with ITLOS, I think, recently.
In very brief terms, the difference between ITLOS and the ICJ is that it's not necessary to have a General Assembly resolution, which of course is a very complex and time-consuming political process. The ITLOS rules allow that international agreement, in particular an intergovernmental organization, to make the request. And that in part explains the establishment of COSIS, although I would emphasize that it is not limited to an ITLOS advisory opinion. It has a broader mandate on the development of international law to serve the interests of small island states. I would also add that ITLOS, unlike the ICJ, is a specialized tribunal. And because UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, the constitution of the oceans, the ocean being the biggest sink by far of excess heat to the tune of 93% and being the foundation of the climate system, the protection of the marine environment is a very big part of the question of what the obligations of states are. There were about 50 states parties and intergovernmental organizations that participated, which is a very significant participation. And Christina will have more to say on this, I'm sure, as well, but there was, I would say, an overwhelming degree of consensus that greenhouse gas emissions constitute pollution. And once you have passed that threshold, all of the obligations to protect and preserve the marine environment are triggered. And fortunately for UNCLOS, those obligations are spelled out in great detail in Part 12. And one of those is the obligation to take the necessary measures to ensure the protection and preservation of the marine environment. And one last point, I think what is especially helpful are not abstract principles of transboundary harm and whatever, but the devil is in the detail. What are the specific obligations of states, individually and collectively? Because even the major polluters would be happy to pay lip service to the principles, but nobody wants to get into the details. Or actually, not nobody. The major polluters don't want to get into the details.
Thank you. You shared with us a video that can explain as well what happened. So I will ask the director to launch this video for just a minute.
Yesterday, we have signed an historic accord to establish a commission.
The commission was made operational yesterday, and it is actually designed to
change the conversation from one of vague voluntary commitments to legally binding obligations and compensation.
The International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea is now in session. L'audience du Tribunal international du droit de la mer est ouverte.
At its third meeting on 26 August 2022, the Commission of Small Island States on Climate Change and International Law decided to request an advisory opinion from the tribunal.
For almost 30 years, small island states have been arguing about the impact of climate change, and there's been little response, and that is what has actually forced us now to have this complementary pathway, this legal pathway, in order to accelerate the climate diplomacy that is taking place with these various COPs.
In my time, I've seen, beaches have started to disappear completely. I'm seeing that the coastline in Antigua looks different than it did when I was a kid, and that was only about 10 years ago. So give it 20 more years or 30 more years, what's going to happen?
So I'm also a mother to a 1-year-old daughter of the Pacific. I'm hopeful that she will be able to return to her ancestral homeland and know that she still has a place there and that it still exists for her to enjoy. And at the same time, I'm worried that it may not be there anymore for her.
1982, UN recognized the Convention of Law of the Sea and the importance of this trial so that people are aware of their obligations.
Thank you.
Life is complicated and it involves difficult choices. We're all
Thank you. And this is the beginning, actually, of what's happening during the hearings. So we'll not screen that. That's about the discussion we have now. But maybe to come back to the video, I don't know when you watched it, but it's like the feelings about what's happening there are strong. And so can you let us know what happens to these hearings? So from Glasgow, a bit about the history just in a minute on how all of this was put in place. And you were like from the corridors.
By way of summary, COSIS was established at COP26 by the Prime Ministers of Antigua and Barbuda and Tuvalu. It was opened for signature by all AOSIS members, so it blossomed into a multilateral agreement. We began with no budget, no support, and within less than 2 years we had 9 small island states. We had quite an impressive legal team. Not me, but my colleagues who were just really remarkable. And we appeared before ITLOS with lightning speed. And there's an important dimension here of the sequencing that we will now have an ITLOS opinion before the ICJ holds its hearing. So the interrelationship between what ITLOS will say and what the ICJ will say is something to really take note of. In terms of the hearing itself, as I said, I certainly did not expect to have 50 states and intergovernmental organizations participate. And it's a sign that states are taking seriously the development of international law. They know that they cannot ignore it, even if we don't have formal enforcement mechanisms, that international law is part of the landscape they need to take seriously. And I would just add by saying that although we prepared our case with robust scientific evidence, 2 scientific experts who had contributed to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a number of scholars of international law, international environmental law in particular, what I think was, in my view, most decisive was when 24-year-old Tuvaluan indigenous mother who you saw in the video, Naima Fifita, stood up and said that my 1-year-old child will never see the island after which my grandfather named me. And I think that that reality has to remain central to the ICJ and all other processes, so people understand this is not an academic exercise. People are going to lose their homes, their ancestral lands, their way of life. So I would just end by saying that to me it was a resounding success because of the dynamics of the hearing itself. So there is a sociological dimension to international litigation as well. It's not just about the jurisprudence, it's about how you mobilize civil society, the international community. And I would add by saying that according to our media agency, 270 media outlets across the world and more than 100 million readers or viewers followed a proceeding in a tribunal which most people haven't even heard about. So it's a good stepping stone now for the ICJ.
Thrilling, thank you. Laura, after these videos and having Payam also to explain why they were engaging around that, and small island countries and communities, for Client Earth, what does it mean and why are we putting efforts as well to contribute to that?
Thank you. So for us, it's also about the people, and it's about the movement, and it's about how do we effect the change we need to see for current generations, for future generations. And Client Earth has had a big focus for a long time now on environmental justice and on the human rights obligation on governments to take action on climate change and environmental issues. So we supported the Torres Strait Islanders, for example, with a case at the UN Human Rights Committee, with the UN Human Rights Rights Committee deciding that the Australian government's inaction on climate change was a violation of their human rights and their right to culture. We've engaged on clean air cases, really trying to bolster that case of a right to a healthy environment. And so now it's just right for us to bring that approach to the international law side and support these efforts. And it's very much for us a supporting role, because this is being driven by these amazing students, youth activists, by COSIS, by small island developing states. But we see that we have a role bringing our legal expertise to this level. And really, as I said before, ensuring that, if we can get that clarification at the international level on states' obligations to tackle climate change, to reduce emissions, whether in the context of the extent to which emissions constitute marine pollution, or in the context of the advisory opinion of the ICJ, that's an incredibly galvanizing thing to really clarify and put the pressure on states to deliver on their international commitments. And so we have supported the push on the ICJ advisory opinion, engaged with states on how they make their submissions, supporting and advising there. We've submitted we made a submission to the ITLOS tribunal. We're present there, and we're submitting an amicus brief to the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. And we really see our role as supporting and advocating and bringing our expertise, but really underpinning these amazing efforts that are being driven by small island developing states and young people, because this is it's about using the law to effect change, but it's about the movement that we are creating and how you change hearts and minds in doing so. Thank you.
Thank you. And what we see is this raison d'être for Payam, for Laura as well. And, things are also happening on paper. So we need the brains and the pens to make sure that we have on paper all the arguments to make. And so, Christina, it brings me as well around the reasons on your engagement around this and what you did with the submissions and works. You mentioned IUCN as well. So how does it work? What have you done, and why have you engaged, all this expertise around this process?
Well, as a scholar, I've worked on this issue for 20 years or something. And the reason why, and I'm not the only one here in the room, obviously, the reason why I find this area very fascinating is that there are obviously some gray areas in international law where we don't have any conclusive answer, no authoritative statement about what exactly the law is. And so from a scholarly perspective, engaging in that is interesting. You can always write a lot of articles and books, but now having the possibility to have these three international courts opinionating on these gray areas is fascinating. And all kudos to small island states, to COSIS. It's clear that we can't protect the marine environment without tackling climate change. But then we have the Convention on the Law of the Sea, which doesn't mention climate change. It was adopted in 1982, at the time when climate change wasn't part of the international agenda. So what the question is how can the legal obligations that you mentioned, Payam, how can they be or should they be interpreted in the context of climate change? The convention is a living document, it's not set in stone, and it needs to be interpreted in the light of challenges that happen at any given moment in time. And the same applies to human rights law. And Laura was speaking to climate change about the people. Again, most of the central human rights treaties do not even mention the environment. We have the recognition of a human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment from the United Nations General Assembly and Human Rights Council, but we don't have it in treaty law necessarily. So it's going to be very interesting to see what does the ICJ or the Inter-American Court on Human Rights say about how to interpret conventions that don't even mention environment in the context of climate change. And the third gray area is the area of customary law, customary international law, where we have a rule that states should prevent significant transboundary harm to areas, other states or areas beyond national jurisdiction. But how does that rule apply to climate change? We don't have any specific or authoritative statement yet, and that makes it really interesting to bring good arguments to those courts and hopefully help them in their deliberations on clarifying those gray areas of international law.
Thank you, Christina. I will ask Cynthia directly because you have to leave in a few minutes. You have another event, so we are delighted to welcome you and be able to have you in the panel. And so we mentioned the expertise with the submissions. You are also a student in law, so bringing all this expertise, but also from the region, how you see this role that the advisory opinions can play from your point of view.
Thank you. I'm sorry about leaving in a few minutes as well. But I just want to say before I begin, I think it's rightly mentioned as well that the whole campaign, the main objective for us, and we always wanted it to be the center as well in terms of campaigning, is that this is not just about stories, this is our lives. So I come from Solomon Islands, with islands that some of them have already seen. And the one that, for example, I come from, Malaita, in Solomon Islands, some of the people that live on one of the islands called Fanale have had to relocate. So growing up with that and seeing the adverse effects of climate change firsthand, it moves you to act because you don't have any other choice. And we would like to have a choice. Choice to move when we want to move, choice to raise our kids where we want to raise them, and choice to pass on our culture to the future generations that are yet to come. And our culture, our way of life, we derive it straight from the land, straight from the ocean. We have spiritual connections to these places. And that is the inspiration and the motivation to come into this space. We were just students starting this process. We were undergrad in Bachelor of Laws at the University of South Pacific, and we were studying international law, and we saw that the climate regime was moving in a pace that does not reflect the agency of the matter for our people. The disconnect between the solution, the action, and the reality on the ground, we felt the brunt of it. We are the communities affected. So with that, and also seeing our people building seawalls when they can, our leaders flying far, like for example, I flew here 2 days, it took some of us to come here. What could we as law students at that time, without believing the power of law, could do to bring that transformative change that we don't just need, we need it for not just us now, but our kids too. So with that in mind, we looked into what can we do. So we were inspired by the initiative that was started by Palau, an island nation. And then we also looked into inter-American courts as well. And then we thought, we need ambitious action. That is what we need. And out of all the legal pathways that we explored, the ICJ-AO advisory opinion was the one that resonated well with us. And we wanted it to come from the human rights perspective, because for us in the Pacific, it's not only a climate crisis, it's also a human rights crisis. And so 2 things that we saw and we campaigned for were protection of our human rights as Pacific Islanders, and as well as intergenerational equity. That is something that we push for. As also shown in the video, for me as well, I don't want to just show a picture of the island that my people come from to my kids one day. I want them to also experience the same childhood and the same cultural environment that I grew up in. And so that is the motivation. And as a law student, with that knowledge that drove me into this space. So having this to go all the way to the International Court of Justice, the stories, and having an opportunity for our stories to be heard at the highest level possible, that's something that we need, because we are very far and people don't hear our stories, but we are the ones that are affected. And so the law can bring that story in this initiative for us. I'm sorry I'm getting a bit emotional, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Cynthia. And Jule, to conclude this first round, can you tell us also what drove this engagement on this issue?
Yeah, thank you. I think it doesn't need further explaining. The first time one of the students from that classroom went to COP25 and met other young people and shared, I think, what we all felt just now, shared that with other young people, inspired others to join. And they said, if we have to go through to the UN General Assembly and we need at least half the world, or ideally the whole world behind us, we need young people to get their own governments on board in the process. And so what Cynthia shared of a spiritual connection to the land, young people and civil society organizations have that all around the world in different ways. And so what we are what we are working on is getting, or that spiritual connection, the inherent motivation and drive that people have to preserve their land, to be able to tell stories to their children, using that and then making the AO a home so that all these stories can find their way to the court. And going forward, I don't think I have the patience to read long legal documents, although I'm training to be a lawyer, so really I should be. But we dream of having all these stories at the courthouse, having people as part of delegations, and these stories to be a part of the official state submission. So we're not just dreaming of a case, but so much more that these stories can be part of that official record forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Jule. And we are here at COP. We actually saw on the video when all of this was launched with ITLOS and COSIS around, I think it was in Glasgow, so you mentioned. It's COP28 now. We are having the global stock take, so this kind of assessment of what has been done, but also looking forward what needs to be done. And so I'd like to know, how do you see the effect of these discussions on the current state of the negotiations, but also meeting with countries, decision makers, leaders? We just had on Friday and Saturdays the Leaders Summit. So how do you see the connection with what happens here, what is being discussed here on decision makers and leaders? Perhaps to start with you, Payam.
Can you hear me? Yeah, it remains to be seen, I think, is the simple answer. We're at the beginning of a process. I believe it's a historical process. This is the beginning and not the end. ITLOS was the opening shot, then there's the ICJ, then there's the treaty on phasing out of fossil fuels, and we have a historic moment where the effects of catastrophic climate change are becoming felt with each passing year. And this will invariably give rise to unprecedented experiments in lawmaking and more broadly global governance. It's not just about norms, but it's about mechanisms to enforce those norms. But at the very least, we can say we tried. That in the toolbox that is available to climate vulnerable states and civil society, this was a front which needed to be opened. But I would just say two things quickly. One is that getting back to the level of participation at the ITLOS hearing, which I certainly did not anticipate, it's a sign that states are taking it seriously. They realize that whatever jurisprudence come out of this process will shape what will happen in the coming years. That's the first thing. The second thing is, other than shaping the negotiations and sending the message that what climate vulnerable states have been insisting on for the past 28 years is already largely part of international law. They don't want some radical reimagining of international law. They simply want the major polluters to comply with their pre-existing obligations. And you saw that time and again in the statements of the prime ministers from the small island states. One last thought, it remains to be seen whether this will also open the way for adversarial litigation, contentious proceedings, which could yet escalate matters further, but I will stop there.
And we are here, the climate regime is also very much defined, but with this Paris Agreement agreed on like at COP21 and then ratified by 196 countries, parties. So as we're speaking about the enforcement and the compliance, there was a lot of debates around the COP21, whether this Paris Agreement was strong enough, what would be the compliance. What we say is like bringing some teeth to climate action. We know that countries and pledges are nationally determined contributions. And so what Client Earth is advocating is about climate laws now, making sure we have the laws in place to implement this ambition. But regarding now the advisory opinions and the Paris Agreement itself here being discussed at the UNFCCC, under the UNFCCC, how do you see, Christina, the connections between all of that, this kind of architecture?
That's a really good question. And I think it's very important to remember that the Paris Agreement, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Paris Agreement remain the cornerstones in these proceedings as well. And they are the multilateral fora where states meet, where cooperation happens, where procedures have been set in motion that are absolutely crucial. For example, the global stocktake. For example, the biannual transparency reports, which are due in 2024, and then the next rounds of NDCs, and again and again. These are absolutely crucial procedures, and we have to be very careful that those procedures are not undermined or sidelined or the bottom kicked out of them by any findings of the courts, because these treaties stay central. And one example, because Payam was talking about the oral statements in Hamburg, and I was there as well, and it was very interesting to see and hear the convergence by parties. And it was not only around that greenhouse gases constitute pollution in the context of the Law of the Sea Convention, but also that climate change needs to be held at 1.5 degrees. And that is due to the Paris Agreement. Otherwise, that argument would have never been made. And some states even went further, saying, what are the obligations by parties? It's the NDCs, but it's also at the highest level of ambition and progression time and time again. So it's very important to recognize the absolute central position of the Paris Agreement in these other proceedings as well, as in a way a minimum standard which cannot be undercut, but also needs to be protected by those different courts.
So we understand, Christina, the connections between all of these and the architecture itself, and how we need to protect each of them, but understanding the connections and how each of them can bring some value and help to this climate ambition. Laura, can you, in terms of climate ambitions, perhaps define, as well as you see under the climate regime, the role of the Paris Agreement and what we're expecting from it, currently at COP28, and then the process for the next steps in terms of advisory opinions on what we expect from that?
Thank you. So I think we're all here looking to see a really ambitious statement in terms of fossil fuel phase out. That's what we need to see at this COP. And of course, these advisory opinions have a role to play there in increasing the pressure on parties to the UNFCCC to do that. It'll remain to be seen whether that is achievable. But there is that momentum growing for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, with now 10 or is it 11 states brought in, but also the WHO, a whole range of other organizations, and really keeping up that pressure and eyes very much on the presidency in terms of what they can deliver in terms of an agreement here in Dubai. I think I might let one of our lawyers talk about next steps in terms of the ICJ process, but one thing that I would say is that we are advocating, along with World's Youth for Climate Justice, we are pushing for parties to engage in a very forward-leaning, for states and for governments to engage in a very, very forward-leaning way with the ICJ advisory opinion process, not in a defensive way, thinking about national interest, thinking about the good of communal interest, the good of future generations. And so we are asking them to engage in a forward-leaning way. We've done a letter together with World's Youth for Climate Justice saying we need you to engage in a fulsome way way, and we need you also to make sure that you are engaging with and reflecting the views of young people, indigenous people, civil society organizations, because under the ICJ process, they of course, only states can make submissions, and it's critically important that the voices of wider society and wider movement are heard in that. And the other thing that we've pushed for very hard is for the ICJ to publish these submissions properly on its website. At the moment, it's not possible for wider opinions, wider interventions to be published, and so that's really important. These are very important issues in terms of access to justice and wider participation in these processes that we, across the board, and I think it's true of the COP process, of the UNFCCC process. It's things that were designed to just be conversations between states, need to be reimagined afresh to enable the proper participation of broader parts of society and make sure that they are reflecting the interests of the people for whom these states represent. Thank you.
Transparency about what will happen is key as well for civil society, as we are here like World Youth for Climate Justice observers, and sometimes the doors are closed and there is no access to the discussions and what's happening. So Jule, any expectations as well for the next steps? How do you see in the future of this process, and what are you expecting from it?
Yeah, thank you very much. First, I'm already quite optimistic, just to link it back to what we're seeing here. More and more, and I think still not enough, we do see that human rights and the climate crisis are thought of together. And that's, of course, not just because of the work that we've done, but that so many people and organizations are doing. So we definitely want to continue seeing kind of the human rights angle be brought in strong, and I think ITLOS gave us some careful hope and optimism that we can see that going forward. And then I mentioned earlier, we definitely dream of the hearing, well, the submissions. So of course, if we are able to access them as civil society, we will be reading them very carefully, and we are prepared, and now I put my campaigner hat on, we are prepared to hold states accountable that say not so helpful things, for their own people, and then young people, civil societies are watching their own governments. And then once the hearings are there, how do we bring stories in a way that it's not, we're not tokenizing them, we're just bringing a story that is going to be told outside of the courthouse, and maybe a small newspaper will pick up on it, but how can we, in a overused word, a meaningful way include the people in that case and really open up the court in the process. There was the founder of the Pacific Island Students always said the court should pay us because we do so much public relations work for them. No one knew that this court existed, and now there's no person in the Pacific who doesn't know what the ICJ is. So I think in the process we also do so much work on just public international law so that people can feel like they're a part of it, and it's not just between states. So that's less tangible for sure, and so maybe we can reconvene in 10 years to speak about whether that worked or not. But I think that's definitely kind of a broad and abstract hope that we also have, that people can be a part of it and feel ownership over the court, over the process, and the outcomes afterwards as well.
And as Christina, you mentioned the Paris Agreement and how we need to deliver as well and to kind of protect this kinds of climate regime here under the UNFCCC. How do you see, Jule, this COP28 in terms of outcomes? What are you expecting from this COP, Jule, for the next days of discussions here?
Yeah, I'm very fortunate that we now have a big team. So we have some people from the Pacific, and we have people young people from all regions really here to meet their own states. As unfortunately, it's much easier to do that here than in their capitals. So we are, still, because the January deadline is so close, our specific focus here is just to do that outreach, to hear from states, are you going to be submitting? Are you interested? Are you even following? There's a disconnect, there's often a misinformation, but the Vanuatu government and their team, they have said time and time again that resources and support is available for those who are interested in engaging. So we're trying to do some of that communication work. If a state is interested, this is how you can get support from others, of course, not from us. So we're really focusing on doing that outreach while we're here, and spaces like this, sharing that this is that the case is going on, looping in other civil society organizations, so that they too can be a part of the case, and they feel ownership, and they feel like the AO can be a home for them. And simultaneously, where of course the AO was always supposed to not kind of overlap with any work that's going on here, but just close gaps in ambition and mitigation, so just be supportive. So we're trying to monitor the space to see where we need to push even stronger, and also I think use the impatience that people have in this process in our favor, so that they'll be even more excited to engage, because they see it as an additional tool to this process.
So this is your work at COP, and actually, this COP started with a decision to operationalize the Loss and Damage Fund. Hearing what Cynthia shared with us around the impacts, but sometimes the loss forever, about territories, communities, nature, I'd like to know exactly how you feel about the impact of the advisory opinions related to the issues being discussed here. So, what will be the effect, for instance, on loss and damage? What will be the effect on mitigation and ambition? Can we get an effect about the next round of pledges, as called as nationally determined contributions? Is there anything related to climate finance? And so all these different issues and priorities being discussed currently here, what would be the issues and the effects on these issues from the advisory opinions? Perhaps starting with you, Christina?
Well, we have to see what the advisory opinions say, but the next round of NDCs, or the successive NDCs, are due in 2025, actually 9 to 12 months before that. So we may not have all the 3 advisory opinions in place before states actually have to submit their next NDC. But what is very important is that in 2025, NDCs will have to reflect each party's highest possible ambition, and they have to progress compared to the previous one. That's the first time that actually bites. That's the first time this provision matters. And another very important element is that NDCs will have to be, or the outcome of the global stocktake has to inform the next round of NDCs. And if you follow the negotiations on the global stocktake, that is not really mentioned. It's a lot of everything, but not that the outcome is actually meant to inform the next round of NDCs. And that's why the global stocktake is 2 years prior to the next round of NDCs. And that happens time and time again. So what can we expect from the advisory opinion? I think pushing ambition, most definitely. I think that would be a loss if that doesn't happen. Pushing ambition in terms of what does it mean to protect and preserve the environment, to take all necessary and adequate measures to protect human rights, but also in terms of what does it mean for each state to deliver NDCs at their highest possible ambition. I don't think we should expect something that is very prescriptive. That is not the place for an advisory opinion, but some general guidance on that. Every single state has to do more, at least those that have higher capacities and higher responsibilities have to deliver at the level of those capacities and responsibilities. I think that's something we perhaps can expect from the opinions.
And Payam, you mentioned at the beginning some initiatives like the fossil fuel non-proliferation initiatives, and we have also small island developing countries joining the initiatives, signing these initiatives. The global stocktake is also being negotiated in terms of what will be decided, phasing down, phasing out fossil fuels, which makes a lot of difference. So, regarding fossil fuels and the future of fossil fuels, how are you seeing the role of the advisory opinions, not saying what will be the conclusions, but how can it play to actually deal with this issue, this challenge?
As I said earlier, I think we are likely to witness a period of unprecedented lawmaking and institution building in the coming years, as humankind confronts the reality of catastrophic climate change. And it's not necessarily because the major polluters will be suddenly be transformed to tree-hugging environmentalists, but it's because the catastrophic effects are inescapable and they have very definite economic and political consequences. And I think in that context, the advisory opinions, on the one hand, help mobilize awareness. They create a momentum in civil society, in diplomatic circles. They help change the conversation, the framing of the issues. But at the end of the day, international law does not enforce itself in the same way as domestic law does. So it's the power of legitimacy, which is derived from the discourse of international law, combined with the fact that history is on the side of those who seek climate justice. Every summer will become more catastrophic until the pain is high enough for the major polluters to change course. I would just say one thing which I alluded to earlier. The power of the advisory opinions is in their simplicity. Before ITLOS, COSI's case was really blindingly obvious. Greenhouse gas emissions are pollution, and here are the obligations to protect and preserve the marine environment. And it helped, as Christina said, that the Paris Agreement recognizes the incontrovertible, incontested scientific truth regarding 1.5 degrees. This is not an ideological debate. There is overwhelming scientific evidence. Nobody, not even the states that were adverse to the advisory opinion, questioned 1.5 degrees. And as I said, I think the time has passed where we can speak in abstract terms about human rights, transboundary harm. The major polluters will be more than happy to hijack the language of international law to say, but of course we agree. And that's the risk in the General Assembly resolution being adopted by consensus. Because what I think the major polluters are going to try to do is to steer the jurisprudence away from the details, from the scientific evidence. So I think for civil society, for the climate vulnerable states, the objective has to be to focus on the evidence, that it's not just transboundary harm, it's not just human rights, it's the obligation to keep temperature rise within 1.5 degrees. That's where the real fight will be, in my view. And that is what will ultimately have an impact on the COP process in the coming years.
So Client Earth is also engaged on litigation and cases. We have one, for instance, in the UK on net zero. Perhaps, Laura, to reflect on that with the litigation piece, understanding how all of this can be used to actually take to account governments, for instance, on their need to fulfill these Paris Agreement goals.
I mean, I think, when I zoom out and I think about the all-encompassing nature of these challenges that we're trying to address, the only conclusion is that you need to come at them from all angles, right, from multiple different ways. And so we need to be coming at it in terms of social movement, from behavioral science, from the technology, of course, the finance. And I think as Client Earth, we try and use the law in lots of different ways. So yes, we hold governments to account for their for delivery of their commitments. So last year in 2022, and on the hottest day of the year in the UK, the High Court ruled that the UK government's net zero strategy was not fit for purpose. It wasn't compliant with the UK Climate Change Act. That was a case that we brought along with Friends of the Earth and the Good Law Project. Sadly, the UK government then went away and revised its net zero strategy, and the new version also doesn't add up. It relies much too much on high-risk, untested technology. It doesn't do enough in terms of the simple things that we know we need to do around energy efficiency, behavioral change. And so I think it's really important that we're using these international angle, and we're coming at it in domestic terms. But critically, it's not, of course, and that's what I was saying before, this is not just about states and state responsibilities, because it's also about the corporates and it's also about the fossil fuel industries. And so litigation is a real tool there to tackle the behavior of these fossil fuel companies, to remove their social license, whether that's litigation against greenwashing, whether it's litigation around fiduciary duties and the obligation of directors to manage climate risk, risk in the interest of the long-term commercial viability of their company and therefore lean into the renewables transition. So, really we need to be coming at it from the movement side, the psychology side, the, pressure on governments, but also that litigation, because there are some who will, that you can try and engage, but actually the only language they really understand is litigation.
And as litigations is probably the last answer we have, if you look before, in terms of drafting the new policies, strategies, laws, building the fields as well with the courts to make sure that all of this is working well with institutions in place and governance. How do you see the effect of the advisory opinions, and how does it translate perhaps to the domestic level? Because as a citizen, I'm just wondering, so if we have a positive outcome, so what in terms of effects in the different jurisdictions and effects on decision-making and decisions to be done? Who wants to respond to this one? Perhaps, yes, Christina.
Well, I mean, the IPCC is very clear, or quite clear, of what the pathways are in order to stay somewhere close to 1.5 degrees, with, let's say, minimum overshoot. But in order to operationalize those pathways, many governments will have to take choices that may not be very popular. It will be a very rapid and drastic transition that has to happen. It has to be a just transition. But it will be tough. It is not an easy road that we are embarking on. And maybe the advisory opinions can help, how can I say, legitimizing in domestic processes, domestic decision makings, for example, the need to reduce emissions in a Paris-aligned way, 30% by 45% by 2050, net zero, middle of the century, and net negative until the end of the century. These are tough choices for any government to make. And maybe having the backup, the legitimacy through an international advisory opinion may help many governments and, as Laura said, private actors to make these choices.
How does it help, Yule? How can it help in terms of domestic and the connection between this international work and the domestic actions, perhaps with your colleagues and where you throw climate justice, on how you can use this as well in different countries?
And maybe this is more probably, I might be stealing your answer here, Laura, but not all countries climate litigation is even possible. And so it gives a tool to young people, to civil society, to hold their governments accountable if their own laws are not quite there yet. So we are hoping to give that as a tool. And of course, I think for us specifically, we have to do capacity building around, when it comes out, what does that mean? We have to do that communication work. The outcome is going to be hundreds of pages of difficult words. So how can we break that down and then make it relevant to people again? And if that is national litigation, we will be there to support youth groups to do that, youth and civil society to do that work domestically. But of course, if we can do it in a more constructive way, if they're willing to see how intergenerational equity can become part of national legislation, if that's not already a case, we're happy to do that. It's much easier than I'm sure others here are more aware of even. It's very tedious and very expensive, but we want afterwards the implementation. The AO is only going to be as good as kind of the third phase, the implementation phase. So we stand ready to, I think, help bridge that communication gap and translate to meaningful, something meaningful to citizens. So it just has to be. Otherwise, we don't have a plan B for that implementation phase. Otherwise.
And before concluding, Payam, do you want to respond to these questions about the connection between the international work and how it plays in domestic jurisdictions?
Well, I can give you an example of dualist versus monist domestic legal systems, which directly incorporate international law. So in Canada, for example, which is sort of the Anglo-American common law system, customary law is directly applicable before the Canadian courts. So the jurisprudence of the ICJ or ITLOS could be invoked directly by litigants before the Canadian courts as a matter of customary law. So there are many possibilities which are yet to be realized. And of course, part of the obligation of states is to regulate entities on their territory, including the energy giants. That will be also a very interesting aspect of the advisory opinion. What is the obligation to regulate the conduct of private entities? And one other thing, when it comes to the fossil fuel treaty and a number of other initiatives, I think that this jurisprudence will also shape how to connect the desired outcome with the different pathways which Christina referred to. And that's why I'm saying that this is just the beginning. There are still several stages of trying to elaborate in greater detail what these obligations actually mean. And I would just end by saying that I don't think anyone realistically can say we're going to litigate climate change out of existence. This goes back to the importance of the COP process. This is not about replacing the COP process. It's about strengthening it and giving it greater vigor and changing the conversation from one of, well, it would be highly desirable if states would consider NDCs that could at some point reach 1.5 degrees, which has failed because now we're set for almost 3 degrees. So to try and breathe new life, in fact, into the COP process by changing the framing of the negotiations.
Thank you. And to conclude, you will be able to meet the panelists just after. There is a space here for you to ask your questions and be able to respond to this also sometimes technical, but also work we are doing. So we'll open to just a question in the room. But before, I'd like to hear about the call to action you may have and how you can, each of you, address it. And for people online, following online, and people will meet later on these issues, what is your call to action following this process? Yule?
I am going to start with a very specific one. Tomorrow at 11 in the Moana Pavilion, Vanuatu has an official side event on the case, and their climate change minister, Ralph Regenvanu, is going to be there, who was the one who received the Pacific students. And I think without him, we wouldn't have this case, I dare say. So if you are a state representative, he's there to answer questions tomorrow, to pull you over the line if you are not yet sure if you're going to be submitting, and is going to bring a team also to talk more about the support that Vanuatu can provide to others who are interested in engaging, but might not have the capacity just yet. So that's a very concrete call to action tomorrow at 11 a.m.
Laura?
Oh, I think we just need to keep building the movement and keeping the pressure up. And this is all about keeping the pressure on those who are in positions of power and are decision makers, whether they're in government or they're in the corporate sector.
Christina.
Well, one side effect of these proceedings is that there will be a wealth of information out there on legal opinions from states, from governmental, international organizations, and from amicus briefs, from NGOs. When it comes to the International Tribunal Law of the Sea, it's all online. They're already. The ICJ has already a table with relevant treaty law, but I hope that the submissions will be online, and the Inter-American Court on Human Rights perhaps as well. But the access to information that is coming out of these proceedings is unparalleled. We've never had anything like that. And I just invite everyone and anyone to have a look at that. I mean, this is material for hundreds of PhDs and master theses and whatever you want to write. But it's really unprecedented, and it's a fantastic moment in time for engaging in the legal discourse and follow that space.
Payam?
You spoke about a call to action, so maybe as the final comment, I would turn back to the youth, and they are going to inherit the planet, and they have a radically different conception of how we define progress, the pursuit of happiness, and all of the profoundly misguided conceptions of this consumerist culture that has brought us to the brink of self-destruction. So I would just say that they're an inspiration to all of us, and we're looking to hand over the baton as soon as possible to them so that we can move on to a better world.
Thank you. Questions from the audience? Up to you now. If you have, I'm going to take 2-3 questions for time consideration. If you can introduce yourself, I will be giving you the microphone first.
Thank you very much. My name is Professor Jackie Peel. I'm from the University of Melbourne, and I wanted to ask the panel, the advisory opinions all focus on state obligations, country obligations. How do you see them having a role or impact in terms of corporate accountability? So that was that shift.
Thank you. Question here.
Kurt Winter, Australian lawyer and climate policy specialist. I've got a question about, you mentioned, it's particularly to the lawyers, around customary international law and the ability to clarify that. What aspects do you think could potentially be clarified? And in terms of some of the fundamental principles under the convention, notably common but differentiated responsibilities, how do you think the court might approach that?
Hi, I'm Sarah Hill-Smith from Legal Response International. It's a question that goes to the potential areas of overlap between the different advisory opinions, using the law of the sea as an example. Obviously, the ITLOS opinion will come out before the ICJ advisory opinion, but do you think that the ICJ advisory opinion would, the ICJ would bypass the opportunity to establish itself as an authority on that area of law? And just kind of refer to the ITLOS AO, or do you think they would make sure that there's consistency and convergence in that and other areas of overlap? Thank you. Sorry for the long question.
So we have 3 questions, and I will invite perhaps Laura first to respond about corporate accountability.
Accountability, there we are. It's very loud back there, so we definitely need the microphones, and I'll speak quite loudly as well, and keep us all awake as well. So I think on corporate accountability, the point has to be that we need states to, and I think, I'm not sure which of you has said that, we need states to regulate the behavior of corporates. We, of course, need states to change what they're doing in terms of public subsidies as well, because at the moment, there's enough money in the mix, it's just going in the wrong place. And so I think that, when you have that increased pressure from above and from below on states, they will need to start doing those really difficult things, changing public flows of finance, regulating corporates. That has to be the way forward. And we have a big focus on trying to establish something akin to the WHO framework on tobacco control. If we could do something similar for the fossil fuel industry, where essentially you cannot, fossil fuels can't advertise, they can't sponsor events, they can't be involved in policy. You would never let a tobacco company come to a cancer conference, but we let fossil fuel companies come to climate conferences. And so I think that's critically important, but it has to be, corporates won't change, some will, the leaders will, but lots, particularly the fossil fuel industry, they're not going to change of their own accord. They need to be made to change.
Thank you. About more specific questions related to international law and conclusion on CBDR, for instance, would you like to respond, Christina, first?
Yeah, I mean, first, I completely concur with Laura that although these proceedings do not target corporate actors, it is within the due diligence required of states to regulate the entities on their territory. Your question about the customary norm of prohibition of significant transboundary harm, and what can that, or could these different proceedings contribute with. One is the clarification of harm per se, especially in that context of accumulation over such a long time, and also being global, many contributors to that harm. The ICJ has never done that in that global context before. It was always like transboundary harm, a pipe here and effect there or in the river, but not in that accumulative setting. Second question, when do we meet the threshold of significant harm? You know, when it comes to climate change, you would think that that's obvious, that we're already there. But it's a legal question of how to define the threshold of significance. And then most central, the question of what is the standard of conduct. And that's a due diligence standard, right? States have to take all the appropriate and necessary measures. And what does that mean in terms of, you know, climate conduct? We do know from other proceedings that due diligence means to take all necessary measures to deploy your best efforts to do the utmost. And I think that's the crucial term. What does it mean to do the utmost when it comes to climate change? And I think that's where the crux is in some of the cases. And it also applies to ITLOS because the obligations under the law of the sea are also due diligence obligations at their core. So we see that cross-fertilization that you also mentioned, maybe from from the ITLOS advisory proceeding on part 12 of UNCLOS and coming over to the ICJ.
Payam, perhaps to respond to the three questions.
Just briefly, I think my colleagues have already answered a lot of questions, but in respect of the conduct of corporations, the classical example, you're a professor, is the Trail Smelter case, right? A smelter which has nothing to do with the government of Canada causes damage to the United States for which Canada becomes liable. So it's very clear that an essential aspect of state obligations and principle of transboundary harm is to regulate conduct on your territory by private persons. And that, in effect, is probably the most important part, with the exception of petroleum producing and exporting states, which have state-owned corporations, whole other issue. And of course, the big scandal at this COP are states which are dramatically increasing fossil fuel production, while at the same time trying to appropriate the discourse of climate change action. So this will be the central issue. I can't say any further now, but the fact that some of those states have taken interest in advisory proceedings is a good sign. They realize what's coming around the corner. And then as to your question about the relation between ITLOS and ICJ, an excellent question, in fact. The ICJ question is much broader than the question put to ITLOS, but it includes UNCLOS as a central part of the question. And because of the centrality of the ocean to the climate system, as I explained earlier, that will be a big part of what the ICJ advisory opinion addresses. There is a general principle of harmonization and aversion to what's called the fragmentation of international law. You don't want international courts and tribunals opposing each other's views, especially where ITLOS is a specialized tribunal which is the guardian of UNCLOS. I would be very surprised if the ICJ would disregard what ITLOS has to say. And if I may just say one thing, because ITLOS is a specialized technical tribunal, there are fewer political considerations. It's a much more science-friendly jurisdiction, as we've seen in numerous other instances. So I think it will have overall a beneficial effect on how the ICJ addresses these issues. And one last thought, what applies to protection of the marine environment, in effect applies to the rest of the environment, especially when the marine environment is such a big part of it. You cannot have a robust opinion on the protection of the marine environment and then say the rest in respect of the atmosphere and land doesn't apply, especially when UNCLOS, in fact, addresses also land-based and atmospheric pollution as well.
Payam, Christina, Jule, and Cynthia, on behalf of Client Earth, with Laura, we would like to thank you for joining this panel and this event. It's a continuing effort together to push to the right directions for more climate ambition. And I invite everybody online and here to consult on our website, clientearth.org, all the information as well, with the ideas, submissions, and papers we made regarding these issues, as well as our report, Climate Laws Now, with all our asks and recommendations for this COP28. Last, thank you to the team who actually prepared and made this possible. They are not here at COP. From Germany, the UK, I'd like to thank Herman, Irene as well as Leah, thank you very much for this work and engagement, as well as Irene for all the publications online. You can find and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter, Client Earth. Thank you.
Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP28 in Dubai. Ambitious, just together.